Hello there! In Acts chapter 8, the Apostle Philip tells the good news of Jesus Christ to an Ethiopian eunuch. The man joyfully accepted baptism from Philip and brought his new faith back to the Ethiopian court. He thereby began the legacy of African Christianity that continues to this day, a vibrant and growing family of faith with ancient roots and fascinating history. Although the Bible does not name this man, tradition gives his name as Simeon Bakos. Join us as we explore the world of ancient African Christianity that he originated. Join us as we follow along in
Supplemental.
Simeon's wake.
Saharan Sabbath. Black Jews in modern Africa.
In 1921, a small apocalyptic religious group clashed with South African police forces. The group was led by one Enoch Mgijima, an independent preacher who had broken away from the Wesleyan Methodist Church after they chastised him for his belief that the world would soon end. He drew like-minded followers to himself, and they squatted on some convenient land, living and working and awaiting the end. South African police forces were called in to remove the group. However, they did not come peaceably, and while they fought bravely, the group had no chance against a police force armed with firearms, tanks, and the whole apparatus of the modern state. Their killing came to be known as the Bulahawk Massacre, and it is still remembered as one of the worst atrocities of the South African regime. But for our story, the most significant moment of this story is the name that Enoch Mgijima gave to his group. They called themselves the Israelites. They kept the Sabbath, celebrated Passover, and generally lived out a Jewish identity. When they clashed with South African police forces, their battle cry was this: "We fight with Jehovah, and Jehovah fights with us." The case of these self-identified South African Israelites is but one example of a much larger trend. Throughout the 20th century, groups from all across Africa began to claim, or rediscover, Jewish lineage. Most of these groups had no genetic link to modern Jews. So what is going on here? Well, the answer is a lot. And even though this is an ancient history podcast, not a modern history podcast, it is worth talking about. Because you see, this story has its roots in ancient history and myth. You may remember that for a while the Jewish people lived as one united kingdom of Israel. This was during the golden age of the Israelite monarchy under Kings David and Solomon. After Solomon's death, however, his son proved a fairly inept politician and managed to lose the northern half of the kingdom in a civil war. Whoops. From that point on, Jews lived in either the northern kingdom, called Israel, or the southern kingdom of Judah. Now, I said it was split in half, but really that's not entirely accurate. The northern kingdom of Israel held 10 of the original 12 tribes, and the southern kingdom had only 2. Most readers of the Old Testament are familiar with the Babylonian exile, in which the southern kingdom of Judah was conquered by Babylon. Its leaders were taken to the Babylonian capital for 70 years of exile. More significant for this story, however, is the Assyrian exile, in which the northern kingdom of Israel was conquered by the Assyrian Empire, and its leaders were exiled from the land forever. To this day, the 10 tribes of Israel have not been regathered. They were scattered among the nations and lost their sense of Jewish identity. Now, the prospect of a group of lost Jews among the world has captured the minds of Jew and Gentile alike. In fact, in some of the literature written around the time of Jesus, it's said that the 10 tribes of Israel made a plan to settle in a faraway land where they could follow the Torah in peace. Later rabbis stated that the 10 tribes had settled beyond a river called the Sambation. The Sambation River has never been located on any map, you understand, and that's probably because it has super magical properties. For 6 days a week, the river flows like normal. But it's not a normal river with boring water. No, it's made entirely of stone and flames all roaring along, like magma. It's like a volcano river or something. You know what's way cooler than a river? A volcano river. As you can imagine, this makes it difficult to cross the Sambation without a good resist fire spell. Now, on the seventh day, the river rests, meaning it stops flowing. Unfortunately, that seventh day happens to be the Sabbath, which means that good observant Jews can't cross it. Thus, the river was a perfect barrier, cutting the 10 tribes off from their Judean cousins. There's definitely some kind of a parallel here to the River Jordan, which formed the historic boundary of the land of Israel. Just as the tribes had to cross over the Jordan River to come into their promised land, so the 10 tribes had to pass beyond the Sambatyon River to settle in their faraway land. Now, how exactly the 10 tribes got beyond this fiery doom river without either breaking the Sabbath or getting burned to a crisp, I don't know. But according to legend, they did it. The lost tribes of Israel became the subject of a very particular kind of yearning. How very human it is to yearn for something better out there. To imagine there's some faraway land that one can escape the pain and frustration of living in, if only one could get there. The fact that we don't know where the 10 tribes made their home is probably the point of this legend. It allowed people to hold out hope for this mythical land until the whole world was mapped. And hope they did. Jew and Gentile alike found evidence of the lost tribes everywhere. In Europe, from 1600 to 1800, there was a common belief that the British people were descendants of the lost tribes. Because if there is any competition with the land of milk and honey, it's surely the grey, eternally rainy fields of the British Isles. One much cooler interpretation is that the samurais of Japan and the Japanese royal family were Jews. That interpretation was also around in the 1600s. And I have to say I quite like this theory. I like the idea that after a crippling defeat by the Assyrian Empire, ancient Jews fled all the way to Japan to study the blade. Perhaps they hoped to return with super awesome katana skills and avenge themselves on the Assyrians. Too bad the Assyrian Empire collapsed before they ever got their chance. Still, another popular theory claims that the 10 tribes built boats and sailed to America, where they became the Native Americans. This theory is mostly popular because it is espoused by the Mormon Church. Now, it would take far too long to list every single theory of Jewish identity. Arabia, Afghanistan, Denmark, India, all of these have been hypothesized realms of the 12 tribes. Zulus, Hottentots, Malagasy, and more were all the descendants of these tribes. In their death, the 10 tribes of Israel have been far more fruitful than they ever could have been in life. Theories of Jewish descent for Africans also got an unexpected boost from European colonizers, who had a bunch of totally unsubstantiated and very racist theories about the origins of African peoples. Their theories were based on the Hebrew Bible and a character with that most un-Hebrew of names, Ham. Now, in the book of Genesis, the patriarch Noah has 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. One night, after the flood has ended and Noah and his family are the only ones left on Earth, Noah gets drunk. I guess you can probably understand why. He's got nobody else to party with. It's only him and a good old bottle of wine. During his drunkenness, he takes off all his clothes. Ham sees his father and laughs at his drunken stupor, while Japheth and Shem scold Ham for being mean to Dad and cover up their father. When he sobers up, Noah curses Ham for being so mean and tells him that as punishment, he will have to be a slave to his brothers. Now that's all the Bible says. It doesn't say if Ham ever actually became a slave to his brothers, or if Noah removed the curse later. But a bunch of European exegetes decided that God turned Ham's skin black as part of his punishment, and that Ham settled in Africa and is the progenitor of all the peoples of Africa. There is absolutely nothing, I repeat, nothing about any of this in the Bible, but that didn't stop European colonizers from seizing on this to justify their enslavement of African peoples. In fact, they went even further in their racism. European historians and anthropologists began to posit that not all Africans were descendants of Ham at all. They said that only some Africans were Hamites, and those were, in their eyes, the better ones. Since Ham was Jewish, and therefore at least originally white in their understanding, they posited that only Hamite Africans brought civilization to Africa. All other Africans were placed even lower on the totem pole. Now, once again, I need to emphasize that this is all very racist and not true in the slightest. But the important part was that Europeans established theoretical links between Africans and Jews, links that Africans would take up for themselves. For you see, the Israelites of South Africa were not the only group of Africans to rediscover a Jewish ancestry. As we said, across the 20th century, groups all across Africa began to do the same. One such group is the Zakar Jews, who can be found in Timbuktu, Mali. The story goes that the Zakar are descended from an ancient tribe of Jews who converted in the face of intense religious pressure from the reigning Islamic government. The group did not declare themselves to be Jewish until 1993, after religious freedom had made it possible not to be persecuted. Now, to be clear, the Zakar Jews would not typically be considered Jewish in terms of religion. The vast majority of them are Muslims, but they only marry other ethnic Jews, and they usually give their children Hebrew names. This is fairly common among groups of African Jews. For many of them, their Jewish heritage is a matter of ancestry and culture, but not necessarily of religious practice. Over in Nigeria, many among the Igbo tribe consider themselves to be Jews, tracing a lineage from the ancient lost tribes of Gad, Zebulun, and Manasseh. Some of the Igbo do practice Judaism. In fact, recently the Igbo created an academy and a library to teach Hebrew. You can find Igbo synagogues as well. But most of them actually identify as Christians. They attend Christian churches and see their Jewish ancestry as fully compatible with their Christian life. And if we travel off the western coast of Africa to Cape Verde, we find yet another fascinating group of folks. Afro-Portuguese Jews, who have maintained an oral tradition of their history. You see, because the island was settled by the highly Catholic Portuguese colonists, it was not safe to openly practice Judaism. And yet, practices persisted in secret. One man told researchers that he could remember his father getting together with other men, covering their heads, and reciting a language that sounded an awful lot like Arabic, another Semitic language. His father would tell him not to trust what the Catholic priests told them. Another knew of a great-grandfather who was forced to become a priest, but accidentally hurt his hand on a sewing machine and just so happened to be forever unable to celebrate the Mass. Funny how that happens. But perhaps the most fascinating story of all is that of the Lemba people, who are found in South Africa and Zimbabwe. The Lemba hold a number of customs similar to those of Jews: circumcision, endogamy, a weekly Sabbath, and purity laws, including a prohibition on eating pork. And the Lemba had a tradition that their ancestors were men who came from far to the north and married local women. Some researchers decided to test this theory genetically, and they found shocking evidence. There was substantial genetic material among the Lemba that was likely of Semitic origin. Now, to be clear, Jews are not the only Semitic group out there. Arabic people, Palestinians, there are plenty of other ethnic groups that could be proffered as an explanation. But given their strong cultural ties to Judaism, it sure seems that the oral histories of the Lemba are true. The Lemba experience raises what for some people is the million-dollar question. What is the likelihood that the claims of these African groups are true? The answer is quite complicated. We do have good evidence for the existence of Jewish traders in Africa from the Middle Ages onward. Might some of those traders have settled down and founded lineages, families, even tribes that endure today? Yes, of course. On the other hand, does that make it likely that every single tribe that claims Jewish ancestry has historical justification? Probably not. Perhaps, however, a better question is this: what does it mean to say that someone is Jewish? In particular, what does it mean for an African to say they are Jewish? Europeans often used the notion of Jewishness as a way of controlling African peoples, justifying their enslavement, as based on their lack of civilization in the European sense of the word. Claiming Jewish identity was a way of taking back power, of owning one's history and ancestry. That is perhaps especially poignant in the wake of colonialism, and lest we forget, colonialism was very much alive and well at the beginning of the 20th century. One could argue it's still alive and well today. And so much of the colonial project was designed to strip Africans of their history. Colonizers kept African stories out of the classrooms, out of the history books, and to the extent possible, out of people's minds. To claim a Jewish identity was a way of claiming a story taken from the very Bibles the colonizers venerated. And perhaps then it is not surprising that in the 20th century, as colonialism began to recede, these sorts of claims began to multiply. I am certainly not going to adjudicate which groups count as Jewish and which do not. That is not my lane. But I do want to suggest that there are multiple ways people can understand themselves to be Jewish. There is an often overlooked verse in Exodus chapter 12, verse 38 to be exact. It states that when the Israelites came out of Egypt, a great crowd of people went along with them, presumably other people who had been oppressed and enslaved by the Egyptians. While this group is not heard from again, we know they travel with the Israelites and appear to become one people with them. Although they may not have been the genetic children of Abraham, this mixed multitude became incorporated into the people of Israel based on their shared solidarity. They had suffered together, they had endured so much together, and now they were one people. And so it has often been. Enslaved African Americans often identified with the enslaved Israelites of Exodus. Their story of liberation gave the African Americans hope in their own trials. Small wonder, perhaps, that so many people on the African continent have also identified with the Jewish story. Across time and space, oppressed people of all tribes and nations have found themselves drawn into Simeon's wake. Thank you for listening to In Simeon's Wake, part of the Earth and Altar Podcast Network. If you liked the episode, please leave it a review and drop a like on that episode at your earliest convenience, or even before. It's nice. If you'd like to support this work, head on over to patreon.com/Ben Wyatt. That's patreon.com/Ben Wyatt, WYATT. Until next time, stay curious.